Here's a problem that medieval soldiers faced that almost nobody talks about, honestly. You're standing on a battlefield. In front of you is a man wearing approximately 60 pounds of interlocking steel plates, hardened to a surface density that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has described as close to impervious against ordinary swords and arrows. The steel over his chest is 3 to 4 millimeters thick. The slope and curve of every surface is engineered so that weapons glance rather than bite. He is moving faster than you expect because the suit is articulated and fitted specifically to his body, and trained men in plate were documented climbing ladders, mounting horses without assistance, and doing cartwheels in full armor. He is carrying a sword that weighs about as much as a large hardback book, and your job is to kill him. This is the engineering problem that defined European warfare for roughly 2 centuries between about 1350 and 1550, and the solutions that soldiers, weapons designers, and military commanders developed to answer it are some of the most brutal, clever, and specific pieces of military technology ever produced. Let's start with what a suit of plate armor actually was. Not the movie version, the real thing. By approximately 1420, European armorers, particularly the workshops of Milan and Augsburg, the two great armor-making centers of the period, had figured out how to case a knight from head to toe in articulated steel plate. Not iron, steel. The distinction matters enormously. In his definitive 2003 metallurgical study of 600 surviving armor pieces, the Knight and the Blast Furnace, Alan Williams of the Royal Armories analyzed the carbon content and hardness of medieval armor and found something that surprises people. The best armor was extraordinarily good. A hardened steel breastplate could achieve a surface hardness of 400 to 800 on the Vickers Pyramid hardness scale, depending on carbon content and heat treatment. To put that in practical terms, a hardened steel breastplate struck head-on by an ordinary sword blade would not be penetrated. The blade would deflect, skid, or simply stop. What the knight wore under the steel was equally important. Against his skin, a linen shirt. Over that, an arming doublet, a padded garment with small patches of mail sewn at the armpits and other gaps, and attachment points called arming points for the steel plates to tie onto. Over that, a full hauberk of mail, interlocked iron rings protecting what the plates didn't cover. Over the mail, the plates themselves, cuisses for the thighs, greaves for the shins, sabatons, articulated foot plates, gauntlets for the hands with individual finger plates, a gorget for the throat, pauldrons for the shoulders, rear braces and vambraces for the upper and lower arms, a breastplate and backplate for the torso, and a helmet. By the 15th century, typically a close helmet or an armet, enclosing the entire head, with a hinged visor that could be raised or lowered. The whole assembly weighed between 45 and 60 pounds, and it was distributed across the body, not concentrated anywhere. A person who has never worn plate armor assumes it's like wearing a single heavy weight. Soldiers who have trained in the modern replicas and historical martial arts practitioners who study this professionally consistently report that the weight is manageable precisely because it is spread. Modern infantry routinely carries 60 to 100 pounds of gear. The comparison that matters is not the weight, but what the weight is doing for you. Now here's the first thing movies always get wrong: the sword. The medieval arming sword, the single most common sword type of the Middle Ages, the weapon every knight carried, what weighed between 2 and 3 pounds. A long sword, the two-handed weapon associated with knights in full plate, typically weighed between 2.5 and 4 pounds. These are precise figures from instruments and armor collections at the Wallace Collection in London, the Royal Armories in Leeds, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Not 20 pounds, not 10 pounds, about as heavy as a medium-sized kitchen knife, balanced and responsive in a trained hand. But against hardened plate armor, that sword, however light, however sharp, was largely useless in the way most people imagine it being used. You could not simply slash at a man in plate and expect to cut him. The science, ABC summary of how armored men were killed puts it plainly. Against the everyday threats of a medieval battlefield, a sword cut, a glancing arrow, or a stray spear thrust, a well-made breastplate was close to impervious. This was not a failure of medieval swords. Medieval swords were precision instruments. They were just the wrong instrument for this specific problem, used in the wrong way. So what was the right instrument? There were several. Each was designed to answer a specific aspect of the problem. Let's go through them one at a time. The warhammer and the mace. These are blunt weapons. No edge, no point, just concentrated mass delivered at speed. A warhammer weighed between 1 and 4 pounds. A mace typically slightly more. Against plate armor, a blunt weapon did something a blade couldn't. It transferred kinetic energy directly through the steel to the body inside. The armor didn't need to be penetrated. The force went through it. A solid hit from a mace to a breastplate would not cut the wearer. But the concussive shock transmitted through 3 millimeters of steel to a man's ribs or skull could fracture bones, rupture organs, cause internal hemorrhage, or produce a concussive brain injury severe enough to drop him. The armor could be intact and the man inside could be dying. Many warhammers and maces also incorporated spikes or picks on the reverse face of the head, specifically designed to punch through or deform plate on impact. A pick concentrates all of a strike's force onto a single small point rather than spreading it across the head. The resulting pressure per square inch is vastly higher than a blunt face delivers, and even hardened steel plate has limits. A sharp pick driven into a breastplate at force will either penetrate it, crack it, or deform it enough to bind the plate against the body inside, which creates its own problems. The poleaxe, also spelled poleaxe, was the weapon most professional men-at-arms of the 15th century considered the optimal tool for fighting another man in full plate. It was a pole arm, approximately 5 to 6 feet long, with a head combining an axe blade, a back spike, and a top spike in various configurations. It weighed between 6 and 7 pounds. In the hands of a trained user, it combined reach, impact force, and multiple attack options. You could strike with the axe blade to test for structural weak points, punch with the top spike at gaps, hook with the pick behind to drag at limbs or the neck, or use the shaft itself as a blocking tool. The surviving 15th century combat manuals, the Fechtbücher or fighting books, written by German and Italian masters, devote more space to poleaxe combat than to almost any other weapon, precisely because fighting in full plate was the professional soldier's primary concern and the poleaxe was the professional's answer to it. The bec de corbin and the halberd served similar purposes. The halberd, a long-shafted weapon with an axe head, back spike, and top spike, was particularly effective at one specific thing, pulling a mounted knight off his horse. The hook configuration of the back spike could catch a plate-armored rider and lever him from the saddle. A knight on the ground was a fundamentally different tactical problem from a knight on horseback. On horseback, he had height, speed, and the capacity to generate the kind of kinetic energy a medieval lance produces. On the ground, he was slower, potentially disoriented, and vulnerable to the specific killing methods that plate made necessary but not impossible. Which brings us to the two categories that actually killed armored knights: blunt trauma and gap targeting. Every piece of plate armor had gaps, not because armorers were incompetent, because the human body needs to move. The armpits could not be covered in rigid plate without preventing the arms from lifting. Elbow joints require articulation. Knee joints require articulation. The groin required specific protection that compromised mobility. A knight needed to use his legs to steer his horse, and heavy groin plates made that difficult. The inner surfaces of the legs behind the knees were often in mail rather than plate for the same reason. The visor of a close helmet had slits for vision and ventilation, narrow but present. The throat, the gorget, was protected but was a narrower piece than the breastplate above it. The specific weapons designed to exploit these gaps were the thrusting daggers, the misericord, and the rondel dagger. Both were designed specifically for one purpose: to be driven through a gap in armor at close range. The misericord, whose name translates roughly as mercy or act of mercy, a grim irony, was a narrow, rigid, triangular sectioned blade of about 12 to 18 inches with a crossguard designed to be gripped firmly for a two-handed downward thrust. It could not be forced through a breastplate head-on. It didn't need to be. It was driven through the visor slit, into the armpit, into the groin, or up under the gorget into the throat. The wound it made was narrow, deep, and reached vital organs or major blood vessels. The technique for reaching these gaps required close quarters work. This is where half-swording and the murder stroke come in, techniques documented in the surviving German Fechtbücher, taught by masters like Fiore de Liberi and Hans Talhofer, and demonstrably practiced in actual combat. Half-swording, half-schwert in the German sources, involved gripping the blade of a longsword approximately halfway up with the gauntleted left hand, while the right hand retained the grip. This shortened the effective length of the weapon, gave the user far more point control, and allowed a stabbing thrust at close range rather than a cut at distance. The manuals describe knights in armor using this technique specifically to find gaps. A short, controlled thrust to the visor or armpit delivering far more precision than any swinging blow. This was not a desperate improvisation. It was a trained technique, documented in multiple 15th century manuscripts and currently practiced by historical European martial arts communities who have reconstructed it from the source material. The murder stroke, Mordschlag, was something different. It involved gripping the sword by the blade with both hands and using the crossguard and pommel as a striking surface, essentially a hardened steel club at the end of a 6-inch handle. A properly landed murder stroke could produce concussive impact, knock the visor up or break it free, or deform a helmet enough to injure or incapacitate the wearer. It was functionally improvising a mace from the weapon you already had in your hand. Now let's talk about arrows, because the longbow versus plate armor question is one of the most persistently misunderstood topics in medieval military history. An experiment documented in historical accounts and replicated in modern tests, a pig carcass was dressed in a plate jacket on its upper half and chainmail on its lower half, then shot at from approximately 30 meters with a replica English war bow. The results were unambiguous. The arrows penetrated the chainmail easily. They bounced off the plate, leaving significant dents but not penetrating. This is consistent with what the historical record shows at Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415, the famous victories of English longbowmen over French men-at-arms. At all three battles, the longbow was devastatingly effective, and at all three battles, large numbers of knights in plate armor were killed or incapacitated. How? Because the arrow's effectiveness against armored men came not primarily from penetration, but from three other mechanisms. First, arrows found gaps. Visors were up, or the neck was exposed, or the inner leg was in mail. Second, the force of an arrow striking plate, even without penetrating, could transmit enough shock to break bones or cause injury, a longbow generating 80 to 150 pounds of draw force striking a breastplate at close range does not leave the man inside unaffected, even if the arrow stops in the steel. Third, and critically, the arrows killed and wounded horses. A destrier without armor protection could be brought down by arrow fire, and a knight thrown from a heavy horse at a full canter was a very different tactical situation from a mounted knight in controlled combat. The crossbow is a different case. A steel crossbow of sufficient weight, 1,000 to 1,200 pounds of pull, achievable with a windlass, could generate bolt velocities capable of penetrating plate at close range. This is part of why the crossbow was banned for use against Christians by the Second Lateran Council in 1139. It was considered an unchivalrous weapon because it could threaten armored knights who, in the social system of the era, were supposed to be captured and ransomed rather than killed by a peasant with a mechanical device from 50 yards away. The ban was largely ignored. Which brings us to the single most underreported aspect of medieval armored warfare: ransom. A knight in quality plate armor was not just physically hard to kill, he was economically dangerous to kill. A wealthy armored knight, captured alive, was worth a significant ransom payment from his family. In many medieval engagements, capturing a valuable prisoner was deliberately preferred over killing him, because the killing produced nothing except a dead enemy, while the capture produced cash. After major engagements, you find evidence of armored knights being spared specifically because their armor marked them as wealthy enough to be ransomed. The financial logic of medieval warfare created a structural incentive not to kill the most heavily armored combatants. This changed in specific contexts. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V ordered the killing of French prisoners mid-battle, a decision that shocked contemporaries, because the situation had become tactically dangerous enough that guarding the prisoners was pulling too many men out of the fight. The sources debate whether the order was fully carried out and how many were killed. What it illustrates is how exceptional it was. Capturing and ransoming armored opponents was so normal that killing them even in an emergency required a specific order. So what actually killed most knights? The record of medieval battles shows that the causes of death in armored combat were frequently not what the theatrical versions of these fights depict. Battlefield wounds to the gaps, the visor, the armpit, the groin, the inner leg, were genuine killers. But the work required to reach those gaps was substantial. Blunt force trauma through the plate was real, particularly from warhammers and pollexes. Being unhorsed and unable to rise, either from the impact of the fall, the weight of the armor, or from mud, made a knight vulnerable to the gap targeting that was otherwise very hard to accomplish against a mobile fighting opponent. But disease and infection killed more medieval soldiers than enemy weapons in almost every campaign on record. A wound that a modern emergency room would handle routinely, even a penetrating wound to an arm or leg, was potentially fatal within days or weeks from sepsis in an era without antisepsis or antibiotics. Knights who survived their wounds frequently did not survive what happened to those wounds afterward. And then finally, there was the development that ended the era of plate armor entirely. Not a more effective sword, not a heavier mace, not a longer pike, the gun. A firearm generating sufficient muzzle velocity simply could not be deflected by a sloped steel surface the way a crossbow bolt or an arrow could. The physics of a bullet's velocity and mass exceeded what even the best hardened plate steel could counter without adding so much weight that the armor became unwearable. Armorers tried. By the late 16th century, some suits of armor were being made thick enough and at sufficient hardness to be pistol-proof at combat range. The result was armor that weighed over 100 pounds. Nobody could fight in it. It became ceremonial. The Metropolitan Museum of Art holds a Milanese full-plate harness from approximately 1485, one of the most complete and finest surviving examples of the form. When researchers examine it up close, what they see is the product of several generations of accumulated engineering knowledge. Slopes calculated to deflect, surfaces hardened beyond what simple iron could achieve, articulation points designed to allow maximum movement while minimizing gap exposure, a total weight distributed so carefully that a trained man in this armor could genuinely fight. It was, by the standards of everything that existed before firearms, extraordinarily close to invincible. The people who fought against it and figured out how to bring it down anyway were doing something that required specific knowledge, specific tools, and the willingness to get very close to a man who was very hard to hurt and do something precise and brutal in a very small space. Medieval warfare was not the dramatic chaos of most movies. At its most sophisticated, it was closer to solving an engineering problem under the worst possible conditions, with the answer being a narrow dagger, driven carefully into exactly the right gap, while the man you were trying to kill was doing the exact same thing to you. Subscribe for more, and let us know in the comments. Which medieval weapon do you think was the most effective answer to plate armor?